In the lead-up to the farewell ceremony, behind the massive oak doors where the coffin was being prepared, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Everything seemed destined to proceed according to a meticulously planned script. A multitude of cameras, strict protocols, endless rows of mourners bowing in respect. However, as it turned out, events were about to take an unexpected turn. Something unusual was happening behind closed doors, hidden from prying eyes. One of the organizers responsible for the final preparations felt an inexplicable chill. It was as if he had been drawn into some sinister game, lifting the veil on one of the greatest mysteries of modern times. Earlier that day, he had been tasked with overseeing the interior of the coffin. This involved more than just decorations. It included special velvet inlays, linings, and hidden pockets traditionally sewn into all royal shrouds. He was told that this was an ancient tradition that required no special attention, but a premonition told him that this time he would encounter something extraordinary. Entering the room, he was blinded by the bright light of the chandeliers reflecting off the golden ornaments of the coffin. Several men in formal suits, representing the royal service, were completing their inspection. He approached them, trying not to draw attention. His task was to check minor details, whether the ribbons were securely sewn, whether the velvet was taut, whether all the fittings were in place. No one expected him to take any independent action, but he noticed something protruding through the slightly open lining. A barely audible rustle of paper broke the solemn silence. Leaning closer, he cautiously bent back the edge of the velvet fabric. In the narrow gap, he discovered a sealed envelope. The royal crest was clearly visible on its red wax seal. What secrets did this mysterious envelope hold, and what mysteries would it reveal? The man immediately realized the extraordinary importance of the find. Such seals rarely came into his sight, and each one indicated documents with the highest level of secrecy. But even more surprising was the date on the back of the envelope. The year indicated referred to the distant 1960s, a period when Elizabeth II was already firmly on the throne, and the world was gradually healing from the wounds inflicted by World War II. How did this mysterious envelope end up in the heart of the royal crypt? Involuntary curiosity and inexplicable fear gripped his mind, causing his palms to sweat. What should he do? Immediately report the find to his superiors, or succumb to temptation and stealthily peek inside? Taking advantage of his colleague's preoccupation, he hastily stepped to my bed and hid the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, convincing himself that he would deal with it later. His heart was pounding in his chest, as if he had committed a grave crime. He felt like he was crossing the line, but insatiable curiosity proved stronger than reason. That evening, returning to his modest apartments on the palace grounds, he immediately began to carefully examine the envelope. Muffled sounds of rehearsing honor guards came from outside, and guards could be seen scurrying around in the courtyard. The wax seal on the envelope looked very old and had clearly been affixed by hand. Elizabeth II's personal crest was clearly visible on it. The man hesitated, fully aware of the enormous risk involved in opening such a document. But if it was hidden in the lining of the coffin, then someone probably expected it to be found someday. Or, on the contrary, this envelope was intended to never see the light of day. A sense of anxiety permeated him, causing his body to tremble involuntarily, but he was determined. After all, the chance to uncover this secret is not given to everyone. With a slight crack, like an echo of time, the seal yielded to his fingers, and from the yellowed envelope, he extracted a sheet of paper marked with an elegant royal coat of arms. The handwriting, clear and confident, indicated that it belonged to Elizabeth herself. His breath caught in his throat with excitement. The words, written with impeccable clarity, instantly captured his attention with their content. The message spoke of a treacherous political conspiracy capable of shattering the foundations of the monarchy. The Queen expressed deep concern that treason was brewing within the walls of the palace, seeking to undermine her reign by exploiting ancient secrets passed down from generation to generation in royal families. But even more horrifying was the mention of a connection with alien intelligence and the existence of an ancient race of reptilians, allegedly related to the monarchy. He ran his eyes over the lines again and again, refusing to believe that these words could have been written by Elizabeth herself. It seemed like an incredible conspiracy theory bordering on madness. However, the letter left no doubt as to its authenticity. Further shocking revelations followed. The Queen reported that a segment of the high aristocracy and influential politicians had long been secretly colluding with certain aliens who arrived from the depths of space centuries ago. Allegedly, these beings, capable of shape-shifting, infiltrated royal dynasties to secretly control humanity. According to the letter, the monarchy is, to some extent, merely a facade for creatures tracing their lineage to a long-vanished civilization capable of assuming human form. Elizabeth, demonstrating a deep understanding of the royal family's genealogy, expressed concerns about the possible loss of control over the reptilian influence, threatening to engulf human civilization. Her words, couched in an unusual official tone, almost devoid of emotional coloring, nevertheless betrayed a hidden fear permeating every line. The concluding part of the message contained a warning. I address you with a final warning. Should these lines fall into the hands of the uninitiated, the consequences may be unpredictable. This was followed by a request to destroy the letter if maintaining secrecy proved impossible. Holding the letter, the author was gripped by a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Part of his mind sought to dismiss everything as a figment of imagination, a morbid absurdity. However, he remembered the rigor and precision with which Elizabeth handled state affairs, never speaking lightly. The letter's date indicated it was written when she was just over 30. The turbulent 60s were in full swing. The advisor, to whom she apparently addressed the letter for unknown reasons, never received it or concealed it. The motives for this action remained unclear. At the same time, one thing became obvious. Publicizing the contents of this letter threatened to trigger a grand scandal. The shadow of suspicion could fall on Elizabeth's entire reign or her descendants who were to inherit the crown. The author could not fully grasp the meaning of the words that the ruling family was not entirely human. The next morning, with a heavy heart and a sense of foreboding, he arose, intending to share the discovered circumstances with a trusted individual. His choice fell on one of the high-ranking funeral organizers, with whom he had a long-standing friendship. He knew this person as a reasonable man capable of keeping secrets. Meeting in a quiet corner of the royal chapel, he briefly outlined the essence of his findings in the coffin and the contents of the letter. Listening to him, his friend paled, then hissed with irritation. "You're insane. This is a secret that is carefully guarded, if there's even a grain of truth to it." He reached for the envelope to show him, but they were suddenly interrupted. Two guards appeared from behind a column. The sound of their footsteps echoed under the chapel's vaults. They instantly fell silent, afraid even to breathe loudly. After that, it became clear that there was no turning back. There were two options: either go to security and hand them the letter, risking his own fate, or try to independently figure out the truth of these incredible theories. They met again in the evening. The friend recalled old palace legends, according to which Elizabeth's ancestors had always possessed a terrifying power of otherworldly origin. He used to consider it just empty tales or artistic exaggeration, but now his confidence was shaken. They concluded that it was necessary to find out who in the palace might have been aware of the threat recorded in the 60s. They had barely made a decision when a swift whirlwind of events engulfed them. Suddenly, representatives of the authorities in strict uniform stunned them with an announcement of an unscheduled inspection. They were stripped of all personal belongings, and every note and mobile phone was thoroughly examined. The protagonist barely avoided exposure, managing to hide the cherished letter at the very bottom of a box of flowers intended for the ceremony's decoration in a truck. A heavy anguish gripped his heart. Their appearance could not be a random coincidence. He felt the all-pervading shadow of an unseen eye hanging over them. Presumably, the top leadership had ordered to find the secret document at all costs to hide its existence forever. But what caused the suspicions? Obviously, a sprawling network of informants was operating within the royal palace, and someone had already discovered the letter's disappearance. Under the cover of night, creeping through the dimly lit corridors of the palace, he made his way to the flower truck. Flickering shadows in the distance seemed to live their own lives. Several times he saw slender silhouettes of guards passing in the light of the lamps. but their movements seemed unnatural, with bizarre bends in their necks and a strange swaying gait. His heart pounded with terror. Was he starting to believe the nonsense in the letter? Or was it just a figment of his imagination? But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by beings who knew neither fatigue nor the need for sleep. Overcome with anxiety, he quickened his pace, trying not to linger his gaze on the ominous darkness. After obtaining the letter, he hurried to a modest office near the palace, hoping to make photocopies of the document. His goal was to preserve at least some of the information in an alternative format in case of failure. Shutting himself in the office, he turned on the desk lamp. Every sound outside the door caused a painful spasm in his chest. He placed the letter on the copier and pressed the button. The machine hummed, but to his utter amazement, the copy came out completely blank. The sheet remained pristine white, as if the text was invisible to the machine. After testing, he confirmed that the device was working properly in normal mode. However, when he tried to copy the royal letter, the letters disappeared as if the paper itself was protected from copying. Old legends of special inks that could not be reproduced mechanically came to mind. It became clear that someone had taken precautions to prevent these words from being multiplied. With trembling hands, he took several photos with his phone. The quality left much to be desired, but it was something. However, when viewing the photos, it turned out that the sharpness was maintained only along the outline of the paper, and the text turned into blurry spots, as if some force was preventing the photographing or copying of the words. He was stunned. Thoughts of advanced technologies and protective measures swirled in his head. But what did magic or alien forces have to do with it? This was the work of those who possessed knowledge and means far beyond the capabilities of modern science. He stared intently at the paper, realizing that only a living witness could confirm the true content of these lines. The photographs were useless, but the authenticity of Elizabeth's autograph was beyond doubt. He had spent years studying royal documents and could not be mistaken. In this situation, there was only one way out: to make the contents of the letter public, voicing it in the presence of trusted persons so that as many people as possible would know the truth before the author was silenced. However, the question of trust becomes crucial because the palace is teeming with spies, and it is impossible to say for sure which of them is already devoted to the interests of this ancient tribe. The next day, the author received information that the coffin had already been sealed and delivered to Westminster Abbey in preparation for the funeral ceremony. All formal checks have been completed. Obviously, the intruders were looking for the envelope, but their search was unsuccessful. It began to seem to the author that the security service was for some reason not yet sure who exactly had taken possession of the letter. Perhaps several people are under suspicion. A feeling of exposure hung over him like the sword of Damocles. Panic was growing, but there was no turning back. A few hours before nightfall, the author organized a meeting with a comrade who had assisted him previously. They secluded themselves in a remote corridor where, according to the author's observations, there were no surveillance cameras. He read part of the letter to his friend. He listened, turning deathly pale and occasionally casting frightened glances around. The author read him the lines in which Elizabeth said that the true nature of the monarchy is a mystery, the disclosure of which would plunge humanity into horror. The Queen seemed to admit that the blood of an ancient race flowed in her veins, possessing the ability to subdue people. And this explains the centuries-old power of the English crown. But most importantly, she warned against transferring power into the wrong hands. If the reptilians belonging to this bloodline are under the influence of a group of radicals, the consequences will be catastrophic. People, as she wrote, will not be able to resist the power contained in the monarch's genes. Elizabeth admitted that there were those among the royal family who were playing a double game, seeking to reveal the true nature and establish a new order. We must not allow them to prevail, she concluded. After the story, his friend was shocked and could not believe what he had heard. He expressed doubts about the authenticity of what was happening, wondering about the possible involvement of the monarchs. The narrator shared his disbelief, but the authenticity of the letter haunted him, making him doubt the reality of what was happening. Suddenly, the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor made them fall silent. A figure in the dark uniform of the palace guard flashed past. Looking closely, the narrator noticed something strange. In the dim light, the guard's eyes seemed to have vertical pupils, like reptiles. In surprise, he recoiled, barely suppressing a scream. But when the guard turned around, his eyes looked perfectly normal. His friend was also frightened. He suggested that they both imagined it, but after reading the letter, everything was perceived differently. The following day, Westminster Abbey was a hive of frantic activity. Preparations for the farewell ceremony were in full swing. The narrator was assigned to the team responsible for seating the guests, who included successors, members of the highest nobility, and foreign delegations. Behind the scenes, rumors circulated about strange occurrences that had accompanied the preparations. There were whispers of scratches found on a stone wall in one of the corridors at night, as if left by claws, and of mysterious figures seen wandering the galleries. However, men in black suits quashed any such talk, demanding silence. Without the letter, the narrator might have dismissed these rumors as the product of superstition, common in days of mourning. But now he was certain that something more than mere human intrigue lay behind these events. Security was on high alert, with agents everywhere, meticulously checking every corner of the abbey. The realization that exposure was inevitable grew with each passing moment, as it was impossible to keep the letter hidden for long. A search could happen at any time, and the secret would be revealed. It was imperative to find a way to get the message out of the palace walls urgently. In a secluded corner, fate brought him together with a mailman who regularly delivered floral arrangements and other luxury items. The man's face was familiar, as he had often appeared there on various errands. Deciding that he was an outsider, the narrator, with trembling lips, handed him the rolled-up letter with a plea. "Deliver this to my longtime friend. I cannot give you the name, but the address is written here. It is extremely important and urgent." The mailman, clearly surprised by the request, nodded, probably expecting a generous reward. Thus hope arose of getting the letter out of the royal residence, avoiding imminent confiscation. A moment of relief washed over him, but within a few hours it became clear that the security agents were on the mailman's trail. He overheard snippets of conversation that indicated the courier had been apprehended right at the exit. Despair drove him to rush to the back gates, but it was too late. A black car with tinted windows stood there, and the mailman, surrounded by two men in dark suits, was being led away. There was no doubt that the letter had fallen into the hands of his adversaries. He cursed his recklessness and haste. The thought of escape flashed through his mind, but the realization that it would only increase suspicion stopped him. All that remained for the protagonist was to feign complete innocence. Towards evening, an official summons for questioning arrived. He was led to a modest room with bare walls, where the pungent smell of cheap disinfectant was unmistakable. A tall man with a piercing, icy gaze awaited him there. He was asked if he had noticed anything unusual during the preparation of the coffin. The protagonist vaguely replied that he had not noticed anything in particular. The interrogator's gaze seemed to burn right through him. Then came a warning that the authorities had become aware of the spread of absurd rumors by some employees of the abbey, and that the royal family would not tolerate such fabrications. There was a distinct steely edge to the man's voice. The protagonist concluded that it was best not to confess to anything. As soon as he left the room, he noticed signs that he was under surveillance. The rest of the day was spent in an atmosphere of intense tension. It seemed that invisible eyes were watching from everywhere, from the walls and ceilings. However, the ceremony was to take place, and all participants took their places. The farewell was characterized by particular solemnity and grandeur. Thousands of guests, mournful music, ancient stone vaults. The coffin, richly decorated with heraldic symbols, stood in the very center of the hall. People passed by, paying their respects, bowing their heads. Many could not hold back. Quiet sobs, but the protagonist, standing somewhere on the sidelines, could not shake the feeling that everything that was happening was merely a carefully staged performance, behind whose pompous facade a desperate struggle was unfolding to keep secret something that could radically change the worldview for millions of people. As the solemn ceremony drew to a close, the electric lights suddenly went out, plunging those present into darkness for a few anxious moments. A restrained murmur swept through the hall, but the emergency lights, which came on instantly, dispelled the gloom. In this ghostly half-light, an ominous picture unfolded before the observer. Shadows slid along the walls, unnaturally elongated and distorted, as if some entities from behind the corners were closely examining those gathered. A sense of inexplicable horror gripped him, but soon the lighting was restored and the official proceedings continued. The guests, of course, attributed the incident to a banal technical malfunction, but the observer knew coincidences were out of the question. Perhaps the ancient forces mentioned in the letter were marking the passing of their chief guardian, implying the key to their secret might be unlocked. As the event concluded and most guests departed, the observer was detained again. This time, without interrogation, he was unceremoniously ushered into a room and told to wait. Time crawled. He wondered if the letter had been discovered, whether the mailman had been questioned and given up his name. Anxiety gnawed at him. Finally, the door opened and a stranger entered. Dressed in a plain, nondescript uniform, he sat silently across from him, pulled out a phone, and quickly typed a few characters. Then, in a quiet but distinct voice, he said, "You found the letter. Where is it?" The observer tried to feign ignorance. The stranger scoffed, "No need to pretend. We know you had it. You probably didn't read it since you gave it to a mailman. The letter has been confiscated. You'd better forget about it." The observer smirked bitterly, but didn't show it. The stranger raised his head and said, "You must understand, Queen Elizabeth suffered from delusions and sometimes recorded her thoughts in writing. This is a document of morbid fantasies. Any leaks will be considered an act of sabotage. Do you understand?" There was an undisguised threat in his voice, but the narrator realized it was just a way to silence him. He also understood that his pursuers were probably mistaken in believing the letter had completely disappeared. They had no idea he had taken precautions of removing some of the pages from the envelope and keeping them in a safe place. Clearly and distinctly, he said, "Yes, I understand." He was released, strictly warned against disclosing any information. It was then that he had a realization. The letter had been torn into several fragments, and perhaps the evildoers only possessed part of the puzzle. That's why they were trying to extract the missing information from him without revealing their hand. It was becoming obvious that the information in the letter was so explosive that it couldn't simply be dismissed as the ramblings of a madman. The narrator understood that even the slightest leak could provoke public outcry, but was torn. Should he destroy the remaining pages and consign everything to oblivion, or reveal the truth to the people? Late that night, his friend asked for an urgent meeting. His appearance suggested many sleepless hours. He recounted that strange individuals had visited him, essentially threatening him and demanding the names of accomplices in spreading lies about reptilians. He stammered, "I thought I saw one of them momentarily change the shape of his face like a flash, and then a normal face again. I'm not crazy." The narrator understood perfectly what his friend was saying. If the letter was to be believed, the top members of this secret organization have the ability to change their human appearance when necessary, although they usually have to carefully maintain the disguise. The narrator didn't know how true this was, but the guard he had seen with the vertical pupil and the rumors that someone had noticed extending jaws didn't seem so absurd anymore. In the current situation, it became obvious that it was necessary to seek help from outside forces to find someone capable of publicizing this incredible story in order to avoid being wiped off the face of the earth as unwanted witnesses. However, the problem was the lack of substantial evidence. The documents mentioned that during the coronation, among other attributes, objects of extraterrestrial origin were used. It was claimed that this was part of a sacred ritual that allowed British monarchs to maintain contact with their ancestors. Such statements sounded so absurd that simply releasing this information to the media would inevitably only provoke ridicule and skepticism. Therefore, it was necessary to present the whole story with all the details and nuances. The author, being completely immersed in the technical aspects, couldn't shake off the nagging thought, what if the opponents really have supernatural abilities that allowed them to neutralize any leak of information. The final day of the mourning events arrived, when the coffin with the monarch's body was solemnly carried out of Westminster Abbey. At first glance, everything was going according to plan. Thousands of people, grieving faces, lamenting the departed queen. However, as the author made his way through this mass of bereaved people, he realized that the real struggle was unfolding behind the scenes, in the shadows, where the fate of the world was being decided. After the official events were over, the protagonist was informed of a forced leave, which effectively meant his exile from the palace. He realized that his silence was the price of survival. Otherwise, he would be eliminated. Risking everything, he sent an encrypted personal message to his friend in another city, containing several key lines from the letter. These lines, taken out of context, might seem meaningless, but he hoped his friend would understand their significance if anything happened to him. Throughout the day, the protagonist engaged in technical preparations for his departure, dismantling the set and packing his belongings. A mixture of longing and adrenaline coursed through him, while security relentlessly monitored his every move. He tried to maintain a calm exterior. At that moment, one of the most respected advisors of the palace approached him, a man who had dedicated decades to serving. The queen, whose name was known to all, the advisor quietly said, looking him in the eye, "You opened the letter, didn't you?" The protagonist flinched, believing he had been exposed, but the advisor continued, "The queen foresaw this day. She left this message for an emergency. Believe me, it's not that simple." Elizabeth maintained a delicate balance between humans and those you call reptilians for years. Beware not only of them, but also of those who seek to expose their secret to incite rebellion or a coup. The queen wanted to protect the monarchy and her people. Her warning is addressed to whoever finds the letter at the right moment. It seems that person is you. The advisor looked intently at the protagonist and added, "Don't make mistakes, boy. The world falls apart when people like you try to simplify complex things. Don't even think about revealing this truth to everyone, or you'll trigger catastrophic consequences." Numbness gripped him, rendering him speechless. The advisor's words echoed in his mind, confirming the ominous truthfulness of the received letter. However, there was no hostility in the man's demeanor. He was likely a guardian of this carefully guarded secret himself, despite belonging to the human race. The protagonist tried to formulate a question, but the advisor was already walking away, uttering a phrase full of bitterness and warning. The pursuit of truth sometimes breeds chaos greater than any lie. The next morning he was summoned and categorically ordered to leave the palace immediately, accompanied by the return of his pass and keys. The expulsion procedure did not take long. Crossing the threshold of the palace gates, he felt a paradoxical combination of emptiness and newfound freedom. Casting a glance at the majestic walls, witnesses to long years spent within them, he noticed a mysterious figure hidden in the shadows on one of the balconies. The face was impossible to discern, but his intuition told him it was one of those mysterious beings or one of the all-knowing guardians protecting age-old secrets. Fear receded, giving way to a pervasive coldness in his soul. Several days later, he attempted to inquire about the fate of his friend from mutual acquaintances, but all searches proved futile. It seemed he had vanished into thin air. He didn't answer phone calls, and he wasn't found at home. Colleagues at the palace insisted that he had resigned voluntarily, without providing any explanation. However, the protagonist knew for sure that his friend would never disappear just like that, without a trace. He concluded that he might have become an innocent victim of powerful forces who decided to cover up all traces leading to the fateful letter. This discovery gave him new resolve. He couldn't allow himself to remain silent, betray his friend's memory, and bury the truth. The question of the promise given to the advisor remains open, as he only warned of potential dangers. However, witnessing the disappearances of people and the cunning concealment of evidence, the character cannot remain indifferent. An anonymous message appears in his email stating, "Keep silent if you value your life. Man should not contend with the wind." Clenching the letter in his hand, the protagonist is filled with anger. It becomes clear that he is still being watched, and they are ready to strike. Nevertheless, he still has fragments of the letter safely hidden, and he perfectly remembers their contents. This text, if skillfully publicized, could cause public outcry. It not only outlines an incredible version of the origin of the monarchs, but also Elizabeth's own fears regarding the destructive activities of these beings, capable of leading to chaos in world politics. Revealing their true nature could radically change many power structures. At night, the protagonist is haunted by nightmares, dimly lit halls, ancient stone dungeons beneath the palace, figures in royal robes shedding their skin, revealing scaly bodies. Perhaps mysterious rituals are still performed in these dungeons. Memories of strange sounds emanating from beneath the palace cause the protagonist great unease. In a desperate search for any clue, the author turned to a person who once studied the myths of lizard monarchs and even published an article on the subject. Initially, the researcher reacted skeptically to the story, but when the author shared some details from the letter, his demeanor changed drastically. "How do you know these details?" he exclaimed, agitated. "These hypotheses were only discussed within a small circle of specialists. It's simply inconceivable." After this sudden shift, he flatly refused to continue the conversation, clearly fearing potential consequences. Thus, this endeavor turned out to be another dead end. Days passed and news channels were filled with reports about the recent ceremony, new successors, and upcoming changes in the power structure. However, not a single publication mentioned any anomalies. It's likely that all the witnesses present at the event were either intimidated or eliminated. The author realized he was completely alone. From time to time, he noticed a strange car in the yard of the house where he was renting a room. The car moved slowly as if tracking him. Once, the author's gaze met the piercing stare of the driver. For a moment, it seemed to him that the stranger's face was painfully elongated, but perhaps it was just the play of light from the headlights. Now, the author is putting his thoughts on paper, trying to piece together all the evidence he has managed to see and read. He has in his possession a letter from Elizabeth II, dated to the 1960s, addressed to an unknown person. The letter contained a warning that monarchs are, in fact, representatives of an ancient reptilian race that came to Earth from the depths of space, and that a fierce struggle for the future of humanity is taking place in the quiet of royal palaces. At first glance, this idea may seem absurd, but the author held an authentic letter with the royal seal in his hands and even felt a certain magical protection when he tried to copy the text. There was little doubt about the authenticity of the information. The truth will probably remain hidden under the veil of time. During her lifetime, Queen Elizabeth might have shed light on the events or convinced him to remain silent. However, with the arrival of new rulers, the monarchy has entered an era of uncertainty, and it is impossible to predict the use of the ancient gift. Among them may be those who are not related to the reptilian lineage, as well as those who are ready to turn the world upside down. The last line of the letter is clearly imprinted in memory. "Remember, the future of the crown and all of humanity depends on who possesses the truth of our blood." The Queen was probably seeking a person who could maintain balance between the two worlds, so that the secret would not destroy human society and subject it to reptilian rule. The waiting weighs heavily, like being stalked by invisible predators, ready to pounce at any moment. Despite the seizure of most of the letter by security services, fragments and memories of every word remain unshakable. These lines leave no room to doubt the reality of the conspiracy. Knowing the truth hurts, realizing the possibility of the existence of creatures hiding their true nature in the midst of human society. Royal families may be just the tip of a vast network. Will ordinary people be able to resist them, or will they have to accept the fate of subordinates? The answer has not yet been found, but the monarchy will undoubtedly feel the echoes of the past, which Elizabeth tried so hard to control more than once. One can only hope that someday a person will appear who can tell the world the whole story and stay alive. Only the passage of time can shed light on this confusing story, revealing new, previously hidden evidence. Perhaps the disappeared friend, having managed to escape the watchful eye of the all-pervasive security system, will triumphantly return, carrying irrefutable evidence. Or fate will decree that an attentive archives sorting through the dusty deposits of the past, will accidentally discover a lost old safe, which will contain another letter, like a message from the distant past. It is possible that the wise queen, foreseeing the coming trials, left several such messages, cleverly hidden in different places and at different times, so that the truth would not sink into oblivion with her departure. After all, the mysterious letter contained a warning that at the moment of an impending threat, when the flame of truth is ready to flare up with renewed force, it is necessary to publicize the carefully guarded secret. But what will happen if this innermost secret falls into the hands of those who seek to enslave humanity? The gaze turns to the window, where the evening twilight gradually engulfs the surrounding world, resurrecting in memory the majestic funeral procession, deceptively calm, through which, like an ominous fog, all-consuming fear seeped. The queen took her numerous secrets to the grave, leaving those of us still living to play blind on an ominous battlefield, where our adversaries are not ordinary people, but creatures seemingly torn from the pages of ancient myths and extraterrestrial realities, possessing the frightening ability to assume human form. Lore has it that in distant times they were sometimes called snake people, serpentines, or the serpent kingdom, shrouding their existence in a veil of mystery and enigma. Legends, like precious stones, were scattered in tales and myths, and then transformed into strange conspiracy theories that most people preferred not to take seriously. However, it seems that the truth is much closer to these wild fantasies than we could ever have imagined. At times he is overcome by a shiver when he catches a fleeting glimpse in the mirror, as a subversive thought creeps in. What if someone suspects him of carrying a sinister power, since he has touched the very core of an unfathomable mystery? He fears the suggestion that it is no accident that some acquaintances cast wary glances at him. What if this ominous gift is transmitted through touch? However, the mysterious letter stated in no uncertain terms that blood ties and a corresponding pedigree were necessary for irreversible transformation. It is probably not given to a mere mortal to become such a monstrous creature. Perhaps he is simply losing his mind under the pressure of unbearable stress. Nevertheless, he is haunted by a sinister premonition that the world around him is rapidly collapsing. If anyone happens to read these rambling notes, let them know he does not seek dubious fame, nor does he desire to harm anyone. He only sincerely wishes that the truth about the monstrous events that occurred during the preparation of Elizabeth II's coffin does not sink into oblivion, and that the mysterious disappearances and sudden deaths of those who were near him do not go unnoticed. The letter written in the Queen's trembling hand in the distant 60s of the last century is not the product of a diseased imagination. Its chilling content boils down to the fact that there is a diabolical conspiracy capable of crushing the centuries-old foundations of the monarchy and causing irreparable harm to all mankind. And at the heart of it all is an ancient lineage whose nature is different from that of humans, but which for centuries has skillfully mimicked humans, hiding under the guise of titles and limitless power. It will probably be decades before the veil of secrecy surrounding the dark sides of power is lifted. In the memory of mankind, Queen Elizabeth will remain a symbol of greatness and immutability. However, historical chronicles are unlikely to preserve mention of the envelope found in her burial bed, an envelope that served as a warning about the fragility of the familiar world order. It is quite possible that the traces of this find have already been destroyed, and the narrator will be branded as a nameless purveyor of slander and will suffer the deserved punishment for it. Nevertheless, he hopes that his confession will reach the ears of those who are able to realize the full seriousness of the impending threat. After all, in the event of a confrontation between the secret race hidden in the monarchical families and humanity, the latter's chances of survival will be negligible. The narrator repeatedly rereads fragments of the message, touching with a trembling finger the lines in which the Queen expresses regret for the impossibility of revealing the whole truth to the people, who are not ready to accept the fact that their rulers are not who they seem to be. She warns that further concealment of the truth will result in submission to an even more powerful and sinister force. The words of the advisor, warning against folly, ring in his head again. Not knowing how to do the right thing, the narrator feels it is his duty to convey the truth, even in a whisper, to those who dare to listen. The further fate of events is beyond his control. He hopes that his actions will be the starting point for the birth of a terrible legend, which some will consider a figment of the imagination, while others will see as the key to understanding the true nature of power. It is quite possible that he will soon be discovered, or he will be forced to lead a nomadic life, constantly changing his appearance. However, he hopes that the lines he has printed will fall into the hands of someone who will one day come into contact with this incredible story. And perhaps when this person notices a slightly dilated pupil in the head of state or pays attention to his strange head turns, he will realize all this is not a figment of the imagination. And when in ancient folios telling about the origin of the ruling dynasty, he comes across mentions of serpentine hearts, he will no longer treat it with ridicule. The familiar world, which seems so unshakable, can turn to dust in an instant. It is enough for the true essence of kings and queens to break free. And while another generation of heirs takes over the reins of power, the aristocrats hidden in the shadows are probably still pulling the invisible strings, controlling the fate of the world. Beneath the luxurious silks and majestic robes, scaly skin is concealed, and instead of sweet speeches of prosperity, ominous commands from the ancient stellar abysses, whence their ancestors came, can be issued at any moment. The long corridors of the palace have witnessed so many secrets that a single fateful paper, hidden beneath the velvet upholstery of a coffin, is but a minor tip of the iceberg. Yet it was this that allowed him to realize how defenseless we are when we succumb to the deceptive sense of stability, naively believing that the power that bestows smiles upon us in public does not harbor a terrifying primal nature. The thickening twilight outside the window once again awakens an anxious feeling of someone's unseen presence, as if a shadow is relentlessly following at his heels. The inevitable finale seems imminent, at least for the narrator. However, despite this, he has no regrets about once deciding to read that very letter, which opened his eyes to the true nature of the world around him. He believes that in the future, perhaps, there will be those who will be able to fully unravel this sinister secret. Let the monarchs and their extraterrestrial kin tremble at the mere thought that the secret of their reptilian blood will someday become public knowledge. Perhaps then humanity will learn to fight back. Or perhaps this will lead to a bloody war, where people will be merely defenseless prey for these all-powerful beings. But conscious choice is always preferable to blind ignorance. The narrator, meanwhile, fades into the shadows, carrying with him fragments of memories. It is unknown whether pursuers will follow him, or whether he will manage to slip out of their clutches. No one guaranteed that knowledge of the truth could save the world, but life in the grip of lies dooms the victims to a miserable existence. Perhaps Elizabeth herself, now resting in her royal tomb, foresaw this very outcome. The hour has come when the letter surfaced, generously paying for it with fear and the deaths of loved ones. The Queen's words, inscribed on the yellowed sheet, have taken root in his consciousness, forever changing his perception of reality. Ahead lies the silence of the night, like predators lurking in the shadows, and the persistent thought that the Queen is only a small part of a vast reptilian empire. Perhaps her death is mourned not only by humans, but also by creatures whose skin is covered with armor of scales. The hero emerges onto a deserted street. In his hands are charred fragments of the letter, like ashes of a long-extinguished truth. The wind, sharp and piercing, raises whirlwinds of sand, burning his face. He carefully presses the scraps to his chest, realizing that this is all that remains of the truth, which has been overshadowed by a veil of darkness and secrets since time immemorial. And as the city lights dispel the darkness, he quietly whispers the lines that survived in the flames. Beware those who are in power.